He now feels like a soldier. He's not just the head of the SS, but he's also a proper soldier. And that's enormously important for him.
Amidst the chaos of a crumbling Third Reich, Joseph Goebbels, the infamous propaganda minister, found himself thrust unexpectedly into the apex of power.
He certainly was no Democrat, but he was very much a German nationalist, but he didn't want to see Germany's name being dragged through the mud.
This is the story of his transient reign, a surreal chapter in the twilight of Nazi Germany, the final days of Hitler and Goebbels' ascension. As April 1945 dawned, the Third Reich, once a formidable force under Adolf Hitler, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Berlin, the heart of Nazi power, lay encircled and besieged by the Soviet forces. Inside the Führer bunker, a desperate atmosphere gripped the Nazi elite as the Red Army inexorably closed in. It was in this setting that the drama of Joseph Goebbels' rise to power unfolded. Joseph Goebbels, known for his fervent oratory and masterful control of Nazi propaganda, had been a steadfast supporter of Hitler. As the Minister of Propaganda, he played a pivotal role in shaping the Nazi narrative. However, even Goebbels could not gloss over the dire situation facing the Reich. Despite his efforts to bolster morale and present a facade of unyielding resistance, the reality of the impending defeat was inescapable. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler, ensconced in his bunker, made the decision to end his life rather than face the ignominy of capture. His suicide was a pivotal moment in World War II, symbolizing the effective end of Nazi Germany. However, contrary to what many might have expected, Hitler's death did not immediately bring an end to the Third Reich's governance. A brief and tumultuous period of transition ensued, at the center of which stood Goebbels. In his final testament, Hitler appointed Goebbels as Chancellor of Germany. This appointment was a surprise to many, including Goebbels himself. The propaganda minister was not seen as the natural successor to Hitler. His ascension was, in part, a result of the disarray within the Nazi leadership and the rapid disintegration of the Reich's command structure. Goebbels' tenure as chancellor was marked by a sense of desperation and futility. With Berlin surrounded and the war effectively lost, there was little he could do to alter the course of events. Nonetheless, Goebbels remained unflinchingly loyal to Hitler's ideology and vision for Germany. He refused to consider surrender, despite the obvious hopelessness of their situation. During his brief time in power, Goebbels attempted to maintain a semblance of control and order. He urged continued resistance against the Allies, clinging to the increasingly unrealistic hope that the Reich could still achieve a favorable outcome. However, these efforts were undermined by the rapidly deteriorating situation on the ground and the disintegration of German military capabilities. Goebbels' ascension to power also had a deeply personal and tragic dimension. Alongside him in the bunker were his wife, Magda, and their 6 young children. In the final days of the Third Reich, the fate of the Goebbels family became inextricably linked with the collapse of Nazi Germany. The decision of Goebbels and his wife to involve their children in their eventual suicide pact remains one of the most haunting and controversial aspects of this period. The end came swiftly for Goebbels. Just a day after Hitler's suicide, on May 1, 1945, he and his wife carried out their plan to end their lives and those of their children. Their deaths marked the end of Goebbels' brief and tragic tenure as chancellor. It was a final fanatical act of loyalty to a lost cause and a regime that had inflicted untold suffering across Europe. Goebbels' ideological journey to power. Joseph Goebbels' rise within the Nazi Party was not just a tale of political ambition, but a journey deeply entrenched in ideological fanaticism and the power of propaganda. His path to power offers a compelling study of how a combination of personal ambition, persuasive rhetoric, and a ruthless exploitation of media helped forge one of the most infamous figures of the Nazi regime. Born in 1897, Goebbels was initially an outsider to the early Nazi Party, having spent his early years grappling with a failed literary career and a sense of personal inadequacy, partly due to a physical disability. Despite these setbacks, he found a resonance with the burgeoning nationalist movements in post-World War I Germany. Goebbels' entry into the Nazi Party in 1924 marked the beginning of his ideological transformation and ascent to power. Goebbels quickly distinguished himself as an orator and an astute propagandist. His early years in the party saw him engaging in street politics, where he honed his skills in public speaking and propaganda. He became adept at using fiery rhetoric to stir emotions and shape public opinion, a talent that did not go unnoticed by the party's leadership, especially Adolf Hitler. In 1926, Goebbels was appointed Gauleiter, district leader of Berlin, a crucial position given the city's political significance. It was here that Goebbels began to fully exploit the potential of propaganda. He skillfully used print media, public rallies, and eventually radio broadcasts to disseminate Nazi ideology and demonize its opponents. His propaganda was not just about promoting Nazi ideals. It was equally focused on creating a scapegoat in the form of Jews and other groups, thereby fostering a culture of hate and division. The year 1930 marked a turning point for Goebbels as he was appointed the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, following the Nazis' electoral successes. This role provided him with an unprecedented platform to mold German society according to Nazi ideals. He took control of the media, arts, and information, effectively turning them into tools for Nazi propaganda. Under Goebbels' direction, the Ministry of Propaganda churned out a relentless stream of Nazi messaging. He understood the psychological aspects of propaganda and used it to foster a cult of personality around Hitler and instill a sense of nationalistic fervor among the German populace. Films, newspapers, radio broadcasts, all were co-opted to serve the Nazi agenda. The 1936 Berlin Olympics, for instance, was used as a stage to promote the image of a peaceful and powerful Germany. Goebbels' propaganda was not limited to glorifying the Nazi regime. It was also instrumental in preparing Germany for war. He used his skills to create an atmosphere of fear and hatred, essential in justifying the regime's expansionist and genocidal policies. When World War II commenced, his propaganda machine worked overtime, maintaining public morale and support for the war, even as the tide turned against Germany. One of Goebbels' most notorious contributions was his role in intensifying anti-Semitic sentiment. He was a key architect of the Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938, where Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes were attacked. This event marked a significant escalation in the Nazi persecution of Jews, leading to the horrors of the Holocaust. As the war progressed and Germany's situation became increasingly dire, Goebbels' propaganda sought to portray an image of resilience and inevitable victory. Even when defeat was imminent, he continued to call for total war and sacrifice from the German people. His fanatical loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi cause remained unshaken till the end. Goebbels' ideological journey culminated in his brief tenure as chancellor following Hitler's suicide. His ascension to this position was less a testament to his political prowess and more a reflection of his unwavering commitment to Nazi ideology and Hitler himself. In his final act, he remained consistent with the narrative he had helped craft, choosing death over surrender. The last hours of the Third Reich. As the Second World War neared its conclusion, the Third Reich, once an imposing and fearsome force across Europe, found itself on the brink of annihilation. The final days of this regime were marked by chaos, desperation, and a rapidly crumbling political and military infrastructure. This chapter delves into the convoluted political and military situation during these terminal hours. By April 1945, the situation for Nazi Germany was dire. The Allies had made significant advances on both the Western and Eastern fronts. The Soviet Union's Red Army was closing in on Berlin, while the Western Allies, primarily the United States and the United Kingdom, were advancing from the West. The Nazi leadership was disintegrating under the pressure, with key figures either defecting, being purged, or losing faith in a victory. In the bunker in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler and his closest associates, including Joseph Goebbels, had taken refuge, the atmosphere was one of defeat, denial, and delusion. Hitler's mental state had deteriorated, and his decision-making became increasingly erratic. The once fearless leader was now gripped by paranoia and despair. refusing to concede defeat and insisting on a fight to the death. The military situation was no less chaotic. German forces, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, were fighting a losing battle. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of territory led to senseless bloodshed and destruction. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the German military, was virtually non-existent, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, plagued by desertions and lacking resources. In these last hours, Goebbels, as Minister for Propaganda, continued to churn out messages of false hope and calls for total war. Despite the evident hopelessness, he remained unwaveringly loyal to Hitler and the Nazi ideology. His broadcasts painted a picture of heroic resistance and imminent victory, far removed from the grim reality. Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, was a turning point. It marked the definitive end of any lingering hopes among the Nazi elite for a miraculous turnaround. Goebbels, now Chancellor, faced an impossible situation. With the Soviet forces just blocks away from the Chancellery, there was no real opportunity for him to govern or change the course of events. The fall of Berlin was imminent. Soviet troops were engaged in fierce street-to-street combat, overcoming the last pockets of German resistance. Inside the bunker, the mood had shifted from delusional optimism to grim acceptance of their fate. Discussions turned to methods of suicide and escape plans rather than military strategies. Outside the bunker, the situation was chaotic. German civilians, soldiers, and foreign workers were caught in the crossfire, facing death, injury, or capture. The city itself was a scene of apocalyptic destruction, with buildings reduced to rubble and streets filled with the debris of war. In these final moments, Goebbels attempted to negotiate a peace settlement with the advancing Soviets, an effort doomed from the start due to the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. When it became clear that there would be no negotiated peace, Goebbels and his wife Magda made the fateful decision to take their own lives and those of their 6 children. The death of Goebbels on May 1, 1945, symbolized the end of the Third Reich's leadership. With Berlin captured and Hitler and Goebbels dead, the remnants of the Nazi regime were leaderless and in disarray. The war in Europe would officially end a few days later, on May 8, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of Germany. Goebbels' family, a tragic end. The final days of the Third Reich not only marked the collapse of a tyrannical regime, but also brought a heart-wrenching conclusion to the family of Joseph Goebbels. This chapter delves into the tragic fate of Goebbels' family, whose end was as dramatic as it was harrowing, reflecting the ultimate human cost of blind fanaticism and loyalty to a doomed cause. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, was not just a high-ranking Nazi official, he was also a family man. He was married to Magda Goebbels, and they had 6 children: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. The Goebbels family was often portrayed as an ideal Nazi family in propaganda materials, embodying the values that the regime sought to promote. However, as the war drew to a close and the reality of defeat loomed, the family's fate took a dark turn. As Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, Goebbels, along with his wife and children, moved into the Führerbunker, a bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. Here, they witnessed the final days of Hitler and the Third Reich. Despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation, Goebbels remained fiercely loyal to Hitler and the Nazi ideology. This unwavering loyalty was shared by his wife Magda, who was equally devoted to the cause. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of despair and denial. As the Red Army encircled Berlin, Goebbels and his wife faced a grim reality. They could not fathom a life after the fall of the Third Reich and were determined not to let themselves or their children live in a world without National Socialism. In a chilling display of their fanaticism, Joseph and Magda Goebbels decided to kill their children and then themselves rather than surrender. The manner in which the Goebbels children were killed remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the Third Reich's final days. According to accounts, Magda and Joseph Goebbels, with the assistance of an SS doctor, administered poison to their children. The children were reportedly given morphine to sedate them and then poisoned with cyanide. This act of killing their own children was justified by Magda Goebbels in her final letter to her son from a previous marriage, Harold Quandt, who was serving in the Luftwaffe. She wrote that the children were too innocent and pure to live in a world without National Socialism. After the death of their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels took their own lives on May 1, 1945. Goebbels shot himself, while Magda either took cyanide or was killed by Goebbels. The exact details remain unclear. Following their suicide, their bodies, like those of Hitler and Eva Braun, were partially burned by remaining SS guards. The death of the Goebbels family, particularly the children, remains a deeply disturbing and poignant symbol of the extent of Nazi fanaticism. The children, innocent and unaware, were victims of their parents' unyielding allegiance to a cause that brought untold suffering to millions. Their deaths also highlight the tragic consequences of ideological indoctrination and the moral corruption that permeated the highest ranks of the Nazi regime. In retrospect, the tragic end of the Goebbels family encapsulates the broader tragedy of the Third Reich. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of extremist ideologies and the devastating impact they can have on families and societies. The Goebbels children were among the last victims of a regime that valued loyalty and ideology over human life and compassion. Their fate is a somber testament to the depths of human cruelty and the destructive power of propaganda and fanaticism. The propaganda minister's final acts. In the waning hours of the Third Reich, Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, assumed the role of Chancellor following Adolf Hitler's suicide. His tenure was brief, lasting barely a day, yet it was marked by a series of desperate actions and decisions that encapsulated the final throes of a crumbling regime. This chapter examines the final acts of Goebbels as Chancellor, revealing the culmination of his unwavering loyalty to Nazi ideology and his ultimate descent into despair and defeat. Upon Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, Goebbels was named his successor. This appointment, dictated in Hitler's last will, was more symbolic than practical, as the Nazi government was effectively collapsing. Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces, and the Allied armies were closing in from the west. In this dire situation, Goebbels' actions as Chancellor were limited and heavily influenced by the circumstances surrounding him. One of his first acts was to deliver a radio broadcast announcing Hitler's death. In this address, he eulogized Hitler as a martyr who had died fighting against Bolshevism and called for continued resistance against the Allies. Despite the hopeless situation, Goebbels' propaganda skills remained evident as he sought to galvanize what was left of the German resistance. Goebbels also attempted to maintain some semblance of governmental structure amid the chaos. He held brief meetings with remaining Nazi officials and military leaders in the Führerbunker, discussing potential military actions and strategies. However, these meetings were largely futile, as real power had slipped from their grasp, and the Nazi leadership was splintered and demoralized. In a final, desperate bid to alter the course of events, Goebbels sought to negotiate with the Soviet forces encircling Berlin. He dispatched General Hans Krebs to meet with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov to discuss terms for a potential ceasefire or peace agreement. However, the Soviets demanded unconditional surrender, a condition that Goebbels was unwilling to accept. The failure of these negotiations left Goebbels with no viable options and signaled the inevitability of the Nazi regime's collapse. One of the most controversial decisions made by Goebbels during his brief tenure was his order to execute Heinrich Himmler's liaison, Hermann Fegelein, who was caught trying to flee Berlin. This act demonstrated Goebbels' adherence to Nazi principles of loyalty and betrayal, even in the regime's final moments. The most tragic and infamous of Goebbels' final acts concerned his own family. Unwilling to live in a world without National Socialism and determined not to allow his children to grow up in a world dominated by what he perceived as the enemies of Germany, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, orchestrated the murder of their 6 young children before committing suicide themselves. This act of murder-suicide, was the ultimate manifestation of Goebbels' fanatical devotion to the Nazi cause and a grim testament to the extent of his ideological indoctrination. In the aftermath of Goebbels' death, the Third Reich effectively ceased to exist. His final acts as chancellor were less about governance and more about the preservation of ideology and the refusal to accept reality. Goebbels, to the very end, remained a propagandist, attempting to shape the narrative of the Nazi downfall as one of heroic resistance rather than acknowledging the regime's inherent brutality and failure. Hitler's succession, a chaotic transition. The transition of power following Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, plunged the already crumbling Third Reich into further disarray. This period was marked by a chaotic power vacuum and intense infighting among Nazi leadership, revealing the underlying fractures and desperation within a regime on the brink of collapse. This chapter examines the tumultuous transition, focusing on the internal dynamics and power struggles that ensued in Hitler's succession. Hitler's demise left a leadership vacuum at a critical juncture for the Third Reich. Although he had named Joseph Goebbels as his successor in his will, along with Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as the President of Germany, these appointments did little to stabilize the rapidly deteriorating situation. The remaining Nazi leaders were either too far from Berlin to exert influence or too embroiled in the chaos to assert effective control. Goebbels, as Hitler's appointed chancellor, held the position for only a brief period before his suicide on May 1, 1945. His tenure was characterized by a lack of real authority and the inability to influence the course of events. The situation in Berlin was beyond salvageable, with Soviet troops already in the city and the remnants of the German army disintegrating. The infighting and power struggles among the Nazi leadership in these final days were symptomatic of the regime's broader issues. Key figures like Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's long-standing SS chief, sought to negotiate independently with the Western Allies, betraying Hitler's directive for unconditional resistance. Himmler's actions were seen as a betrayal by Hitler and his inner circle, leading to his expulsion from the party and his roles within the regime. Furthermore, the ambiguous loyalty of other high-ranking officials added to the chaos. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and once designated as Hitler's successor, found himself sidelined and accused of treason for his attempt to assume leadership based on a 1941 decree from Hitler, should the Führer become incapacitated. This move was perceived as opportunistic, leading to Göring's dismissal and arrest in the final days of the war. In the absence of clear, centralized leadership, regional Nazi officials and military commanders often acted independently. This disjointed response further exacerbated the disintegration of Nazi control over Germany. The lack of coherent leadership and the breakdown of command structures meant there was no unified strategy to address the advancing Allied forces or manage the collapsing state. The power vacuum and infighting also reflected the deep-rooted ideological and personal rivalries within the Nazi hierarchy. The party, which had thrived on propaganda, authoritarian control, and the cult of personality around Hitler, found itself directionless without its central figure. The lack of a clear succession plan and the personal ambitions of various leaders led to a fragmented and ineffective response in the face of impending defeat. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was in Flensburg, a town far from Berlin, eventually took over as the head of the German state following Goebbels' death. However, his authority was limited, and his primary role became the negotiation of surrender to the Allied forces. Dönitz's government, often referred to as the Flensburg government, was short-lived and primarily focused on capitulation and managing the aftermath of the war. The chaotic transition of power in the last days of the Third Reich serves as a stark example of the inherent instability and unsustainability of totalitarian regimes. The internal divisions, lack of clear succession planning, and personal ambitions of Nazi leaders contributed to the rapid collapse of the regime once its central figure was gone.